Those who don't know me, I'm Tina Klein. I'm a professor in the English department and a teacher of courses on Korean cinema and Asian cinema. And I welcome you to this first event in our Asian Studies Distinguished Lecture Series. The series is funded by a generous BC alum who had the opportunity to take Chinese literature or language classes when he was here and wanted to give something back. And so he very generously endowed this speaker series as a way to help develop the Asian Studies program. The mission of the series is to bring scholars and journalists and writers and thinkers to campus, people who can enhance our understanding of Asia and the world and America's relationship to Asia. I think the series is really a sign of the growing strength of the Asian Studies program here at BC. There's a lot of energy and a lot of interest, I think, across the university in Asia courses and events, and an interest in making Asia central to the big Boston College education for the students. The last week we launched the program. The Asian Studies launched a Career Navigator series, which brings BC alums to campus to talk about the work that they are currently doing. It's a kind of a professional career and professional series. So last week was about people working in China, and I think next semester think about just a similar event with people working in Japan and Korea. So keep your eyes open for that. Please check out the Asian Studies homepage for upcoming events, and you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter, right, Lydia? There we are. So without further ado, let me introduce tonight's speaker, who is Euny Hong. Ms. Hong was born in Korea and grew up both in Chicago and the Gangnam neighborhood of Seoul. So she's got a unique perspective on Korean culture. She's a Boston-based journalist, so a local person with international experience in web, print, and television news. She started her career as a TV columnist for the Financial Times, and her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic, the Boston Globe, and many other publications. She's also the author of a novel called Kept, a comedy of sex and manners. And her most recent book, and the one she's going to talk about tonight, is The Birth of Korean Cool, How One Nation is Conquering the World Through Pop Culture, a title that kind of says it all. The book has received rave reviews and was dubbed fabulously snarky by The Guardian in UK. Please join me in welcoming Euny Hong.
Well, thanks so much for coming, you guys. Thank you to Boston College, to my unknown benefactor that I just found out about, Professor Klein. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here. By way of personal background, I would say that I am a pretty bad, or have always been a really bad Asian American. I spent my childhood in the U.S. Actually, I was born in the States, and then we moved to Korea when I was 12, so it was sort of a reverse immigration. And I had bad memories of being a Korean American in Chicago. I had bad memories of being Korean in Korea. I lived in Korea from age 12 to 18, and I just didn't want to deal with it. And so when I went to college, I was basically unofficially barred from the Korean Students Association because they just didn't understand me, and I didn't understand what they were talking about either. Because there was a dialectic of minorityness that I had sort of missed out on because I hadn't lived here, and I just realized there was a huge divide between being Korean American and being Korean, and so the president of the Korean Students Association at Yale said, "Have you ever heard the expression, it's a black thing you wouldn't understand?" I said, "No, actually, I've been living in Korea, so we don't say stuff like that." And he's like, "Well, the same applies here." And so basically, I wasn't allowed to join the Korean Students Association. And then I lived in Europe for 9 years, and TLDR was not interested in being Asian American. Okay, but then, and actually, it was in Europe that I discovered the Korean wave. Strangely enough, I was not paying any attention to what was going on in Korea, pop culture-wise. Then in around 2006, I was living in France at the time, and people started to say, "Oh, you're from Korea," because whatever, they're not going to understand Korean Americans. "Oh, you're from Korea." I watch every single Korean movie that comes out, and I was just like, "Oh, That's interesting, because French people are very fond of cinema historically, and they're also just used to reading subtitles anyway. So I was like, well, it's not a big deal for them to watch a Korean film. So it's just like this must be just a weird French thing. And then a couple of years later, people started saying, I'm completely addicted to K-pop songs, and I thought, okay, that's a little bit strange as well. But I was just kind of I guess you could almost say weird kind of denial, because I was trying to assimilate into French culture, and I didn't want all this confusion about having to answer these questions about being Korean. And then around 2007, 2008, I finally realized something was actually happening globally, because French people started to say, well, actually, I'm really addicted to Korean dramas too. And what's said a little bit, the reason it happened around that time is that, Korea has always been very, very advanced in terms of broadband. Around 2007, 2008 is how long it took for Western Europe to catch up enough that they could actually do live streaming of Korean dramas. So that's a big reason for why the Korean pop culture explosion is happening now. And around the same time, while I was there, at the end of 2006, all of the top French newspapers said the best movie of the year is The Host, which is a Bong Joon-ho movie about a creature that's born because the Americans pour toxins into the Han River. And the Cahiers du Cinéma, Le Monde, Figaro, at the end of the year, they said this is one of the best movies of the year, if not the decade. That might be a little bit of a hyperbole. But and then when I was in Paris, there was a K-pop concert, and there was only going to be one. And it was at this huge arena called the Zénith, and that's like where, Michael Jackson, would have played. It's humongous. And the tickets sold out in 15 minutes. So there were actually flash mobs, 11 flash mobs, staged simultaneously in various cities in France, requesting that there be another concert. So another concert came about. Now there's something very important you have to know about these flash mobs, which ties into the thesis of the book. The flash mobs did not happen by accident. And they were not organized by French people either. It was all very indirectly, directly brought about because somebody at the Paris branch of the Korean Cultural Center had this network of French people who were aficionados of Korean pop culture, and he told them to stage flash mobs, and then he tipped off the press, anonymous tips to the French press that there might be a flash mob in front of the pyramid of the Louvre or something. So why is this significant? Because this was done with taxpayer money, government money, public funds. And one of the reasons that we're seeing this seeming explosion of Korean food, cinema, dramas, fashion, and cosmetics even, everyone thinks that they discovered trends on their own because, they're hip and their friends are hip and, they got sent these videos because they have cool friends, and that's actually not really the case. It's all carefully orchestrated and coordinated by the Korean government. And what we're now seeing is just the fruition of actually 2 decades of effort on the part of the Korean government in cooperation with private industry and Korean citizens. So how do we get from there to here? What I mean by that is in the 50s, right after the Korean War, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world. It was poorer than most of Sub-Saharan Africa. Until the mid-70s, South Korea was actually poorer than North Korea. And then suddenly now, well, it's not suddenly, but now Korea is one of the richest countries in the world. They're the leading manufacturers of semiconductors. Smartphones far outsell Apple. Plasma screen TVs, et cetera, et cetera. So how did this happen in the space of 60 years? Well, there are a couple of things. One is, as I mentioned, government intervention. One is a weird thing about the Korean character. And the third, which is what I'm going to start with, is that the opportunity had to be there, meaning that we're at a time in history where for the first time there's actually room for another pop culture player besides the United States. In the 20th century, America dominated the pop culture scene, mainly because they were the protectors of the world, quite literally. They won World War II. They defeated Hitler. They financed the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan by giving billions of dollars. That's where the Marshall Scholarship comes from. It's sort of like a thank you to America for giving them money after the Second World War. And during the Cold War, the US was literally the only thing standing between most of the world and the threat of Soviet invasion, which now sounds really like a joke. But when I was growing up, the Cold War was a real thing, and we were always thinking about nuclear holocaust. And so it was in this environment that America was synonymous with cool. So anything that America did was basically irreproachably cool. During the period of the Iron Curtain, if you were an American backpacker, let's say in the 70s, and you were in the former Yugoslavia, and you brought just like your old pair of Levi's jeans, you could trade this to a Yugoslav for a car. And we were thinking, well, why would you do this? That's, they presumably don't have a huge income. What's the big deal about American jeans? And the answer is that, as history has shown over and over again, pop culture is hugely, hugely important to people who are living in oppressive environments in third world countries. If we hear a song, if I hear Forever Young by Alphaville, I think, oh, that was my prom song. And, that's about it. That's the level. It's just like this big nostalgia. Whereas, if you were living in Prague, during the time of the Velvet Revolution, which, I don't know if you know this, but it's called the Velvet Revolution because the anarchists or whatever were listening to the American band, the Velvet Underground. Pop culture for people who are not as fortunate as we are is hugely important as a symbol of freedom, as a symbol of what lies outside your borders, as a symbol of hope for the future. And that's why, for example, I'm sure you heard all these stories about, people in North Korea risking their lives to smuggle in Korean dramas, K-pop songs, and choco pies, which are like these these chocolate-covered marshmallow pies that I ate as a kid. It's just junk food. Why would you risk your life over this? And the answer, well, I just gave it to you, is that North Koreans look at this and they say, okay, this is actually tactile proof that you can see, taste, smell, hear, whatever, that maybe what we've been taught this whole time is not real. North Korea was in a very different situation from every other isolated country. So if you think about the Eastern Bloc, for example, even East Germany always had access to West German radio, West German TV. I mean, it was through the air. So people who grew up there were like, yeah, we kind of didn't really believe the propaganda. And a lot of people I know who grew up in Eastern Europe say the same thing. Whereas in North Korea, I don't know that many North Koreans. We only hear what we hear from refugees. But they really did believe it because they don't have the advantage that East Germany had. They never got to have Korean radio accidentally. They still don't even really have the internet. I actually just reviewed a book you should really look at, by Suki Kim, called Without You, There's No Us. And I think she's like a completely crazy person. I say that with respect. She spent a year teaching English to North Korea's elite. And she's probably got a bounty on her head, frankly, for revealing the stuff that she revealed. But one of the things she said is that she was teaching at North Korea's foremost technical college, like their MIT or whatever, and none of them had any idea how to use computers, basically. And they had an intranet, which was only searchable within North Korea. There were like a few dozen entries for anything you would put in. Suki Kim says that during the time that she was teaching there, for the first time ever, the university was going to let a small number of engineering students use Google. But they were not allowed to tell anyone that they were using Google. And so this is sort of, you can see the beginning of the end here. Like once you have Google, I mean, everything else will probably follow. And that's very strange because for there are 30 to 50,000 American soldiers in Korea stationed there, assuming that they're there because there's going to be some kind of invasion, or everyone assumed, well, the only way that we can topple the North Korean Empire is to assassinate the dynasty or something. But the solution is very clear to most people: is not going to be military. It's going to happen by itself through this thing that is sometimes called soft power. So what is soft power? It's a term that was developed by a Harvard professor named Joseph Nye, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Hard power is military power that what America had in the 20th century. Soft power is basically what Korea is doing now, which is all of this effort in making the pop culture factory of the world. It might just sound like a really just weird, stupid idea, like a teenager saying, let's form a band or something. But this is all about creating Korea as a national brand. And the idea is, well, okay, like you think you're just listening to K-pop songs, but what's actually happening, and it's more obvious outside the US than inside the US. People becoming addicted to K-pop songs and videos, well, they're more likely to buy Samsung phones because that's what people are using in the dramas, and and so on and so on. This is all pre-planned, so that even after people stop listening to K-pop, which everyone knows is going to happen. I mean, nobody I talked to in Korea, from the highest levels of government to the record industry, said K-pop is here to stay forever. I mean, historically, there's never been any movement that stayed there forever. I mean, punk, no matter how strong it was, maximum shelf life for any big music trend is 5 years. But it doesn't matter, because for Korea, the goal was never just to make the whole world aware of K-pop. It's the whole package, this amphibious assault to make Korea in the 21st century what America was in the 20th century, which is to say a nation that, just by virtue of existing and by virtue of being cool, everything that they make, people just automatically want it. That is the end game. The end game is not Gangnam Style, it's not 21, it's not getting everyone to eat kimchi. It's just this sort of unattainable, or seemingly unattainable, status that the United States had in the 20th century. So that said, of course, nobody expected that the shot heard around the world was going to be Psy. I think even Psy doesn't understand. I think he's the last person to understand what happened. He's not part of the K-pop system. He wasn't put through the K-pop factory, which is to say, like, normally the way a K-pop star is formed is it's kind of like Bolshoi ballerina, Romanian gymnast, and now no country actually does this anymore except basically Korea, where they recruit children, essentially, age 12 or so, to practice being in a band. So the contract is 13 years oftentimes, which would be unheard of in the United States record industry, and even if it existed, it would be completely unenforceable. Why is this contract so long? It's because, well, they're supposed to practice for 7 or 8 years before they're even allowed to perform publicly. They're literally not allowed to be seen until everything is perfect. So basically half that time is spent in training. If the contract isn't 13 years long, the record company cannot make any money. So from a business point of view, this makes perfect sense. This is why no other country has been able to do what Korea has done, which is to be the first non-English speaking country in the world to try to be a major exporter of popular culture. So how did this all start? I said this is actually a 2-decade plan. Koreans are known for doing really well in crisis situations. And this whole project was born out of the worst financial crisis that Asia ever had, and definitely that Korea ever had. In 1997-98, it's kind of like what we're seeing now in the European Union with Greece. There was a domino effect. I think it started in Thailand, and all of Asia was basically completely devastated economically. Korea, which had been growing exponentially in wealth, was suddenly in a lot of trouble. It was basically what Greece is now. And they had to take out a big loan from the International Monetary Fund, and the part of the Korean constitution, not the constitution like law, but the personal constitution is they hate to be in debt. They hate it. So when they took out the IMF loan, it was called the National Day of Mourning, and the president at the time said, "I am whipping myself every day out of humiliation that my country has been brought to its knees." So this seems like a really weird time to decide, okay, we're going to get out of this crisis by becoming the world's top exporter of pop culture. That would be like saying, okay, we're going to a desert island. I'm not going to bring any food. I'm just going to bring, CDs or my iPod or something. But that's exactly what Korea did, and there was method to the madness. They weren't just being crazy. They were being crazy, but it wasn't just being crazy. The president at the time, Kim Dae-jung, he's probably best known worldwide because he had the famous handshake with Kim Jong-il, and then he won the Nobel Peace Prize, and then later it was materialized they basically bought that handshake. It was very corrupt and very controversial. But as far as the K-pop story, the Korean wave story is concerned, Kim Dae-jung is the hero of it. He started the whole thing. He and his government basically did what I'm sure, like when you're seniors, a bunch you're going to apply to McKinsey or Bain or BCG. And Korea basically did to the country what a management consultant would do to a corporation. And they said, okay, what do we need to do for this economy as a whole? We need to diversify our revenue sources. A big problem with the economy, even now to a lesser extent, is that a huge proportion of the GDP comes from the giant conglomerates, which are called chaebols, like Samsung, Hyundai, LG. If you add them up, it's about half of Korea's GDP. And that was sort of the root of the problem, is that if one of those countries failed, or not even failed, but just defaulted on their debts through no fault of their own, then the whole country would have to default on its debts, and that's exactly what happened. So Kim's government said, okay, we need to do something besides semiconductors, even though we're known for it now, this might not be a lasting thing. We have to always think about the next thing. Our big Achilles heel is that we're always just thinking about now and how do we make money now. From now on, we have to start thinking 5 years in the future, 10 years in the future. So what is the next thing? So this is the late 90s. At the time, well, the World Wide Web had been around for a while, but it was mostly just being used by techies. And there was no one country that had a huge advantage over any other country. So Korea realized that they could actually be the world's most connected country in the world without having to play catch-up. America, for once, America wasn't ahead, Japan wasn't ahead. It was a level playing field. So the president basically ordered fiber optic cables to be built around the entire country. He said, we want 100% penetration of broadband. Every man, woman, and child is going to have access to the internet. Because otherwise it's pointless. Like if you have a telephone, in your village for the first time and only 20 people have it, it's completely pointless. They were not going to wait for the free market to decide, for people to see ads on TV going, oh, I want some of this internet. That's, and that just takes too long. Like if you think, if you're American, if you think about the time between when you wrote your first email and then your grandmother started using FaceTime on an iPad, that's probably 10 years, and Korea didn't want to wait this long. So not only did they install fiber optics throughout the entire country, they also created government subsidies so that poor people could have access to the internet. So basically the entire country went from being not wired at all, in fact some people still didn't have telephone service, to being the most connected country in the world, which it still is. And in fact there are plans next year for all textbooks in the entire public school system to be replaced by tablets. And it's going to be the first country to do this. So what's the point of all this? Like, why did they say we want internet connection? Now it seems obvious because broadband is the reason that the Korean wave was able to spread. What do I mean by that? Like if I think about non-Koreans who say, I love K-pop, I can't think of a single one who discovered a K-pop song through an MP3. 100% of the time it's because they saw a video. Right, so that's why internet, this plan to become the most connected country in the world and the pop culture boom, this all sort of went hand in hand. And so some of it was incredible foresight, but they say necessity is the mother of invention. That's definitely the case in Korea. One of the big secrets to its success is simply that they did what was just obviously necessary. I mean, there was some genius behind it, but mostly they were just being practical. So for example, the way that Samsung became, originally it was a food exporter. They literally sold dried fish. And then when now they sell semiconductors, and how did this happen? Well, when they were basically retooling themselves, in the early 90s, they had like a big what do we do with ourselves kind of meeting. And by then they were making electronics, but they were terrible, and among the expat community, Samsung was called Samsung. Because anything that you bought that was Samsung was just understood it was going to break. When we moved to Korea in 1985, we bought a Sony TV to bring to Seoul at huge expense, because we just knew that we were not going to buy a Korean-made TV no matter what, because that would just be the equivalent of buying a big, heavy box with a bulb in it that didn't do anything except, you could put your little figurines on it or something. So that was then, and this is now. What happened was, again, they were like, okay, what can we do where we don't have to play catch up? One of the smartest things that Samsung ever did was that they, at the time, you probably don't remember this, it was not clear whether technology and TV and so forth was going to be digital or analog. America held on to the very, very, very last second switching over to digital TV. They were one of the last countries in the world to do it. And in the early 90s, it wasn't really clear which one was going to win. Korea picked digital, and it's not because they had a crystal ball. It's because they didn't have a choice. They could not catch up with Mitsubishi or Sony in analog. They were way ahead of Korea. But with digital, it's all binary. It's ones and zeros. So even if you have a really mediocre factory with bad conditions or something, I'm not saying that they did, if anybody could make a semiconductor. A bad semiconductor basically is as good as a good semiconductor, because it's all binary. And so that was one of the big things that helped turn Samsung around. Also, there was good marketing and good leadership and so forth. But a lot of it was just making sound business decisions. And like I said, Korea treats itself like a corporation. And in fact, Korea is actually the only liberal capitalist democracy in the entire world that can act like a command economy when necessary. There's no other country in the world that is a first world country where the government can tell private industry what to do. In Korea, you can get away with this. In America, you could never do something like that. And this is one of the reasons that the Korean pop culture boom was able to happen, because the Korean government basically is subsidizing this from the very earliest days. I mean, it seems hard to believe now, but there was a time when there's no demand for Korean dramas outside of Korea. And the first country that was going to do this was Hong Kong. There was no obvious desire for this. There was no demand. It was Korea's desire. It was Korea's idea to push it. So they translated, at government expense, a soap opera called What Is Love All About? From Korean into Chinese, because ATV in Hong Kong didn't want to show it. And so the Korean government, actually specifically was the consulate and Ministry of Culture, they said, okay, well, we'll translate it for you, we'll pay for it, we'll even sell ad time. All you have to do is press play. And so ATV said, okay, that's what we'll do. And then the rest is history. At Thursday night when the show was airing, legendarily anyway, the streets of Hong Kong completely emptied out because everyone was watching the show. That was in 1992. And basically every single major coup in the pop culture story was pushed by the Korean government. Korea still pays for translation. They don't have to, but they do. I mean, they pay, like they go after countries that are too poor for America to care about, and that's a really big, important decision that they made. The subtitle of this book is How One Nation is Conquering the World Through Pop Culture. But the unofficial subtitle is Why America is Losing the Keys to the Kingdom. This, when I say this, it's frequently very unpopular, but I mean, you guys are smart, you're undergrads, I'm sure you can handle it. I mentioned that one of the reasons the pop culture boom and the Korean wave was able to happen is that there was room for it. And there was room for it not because the Americans were polite and said, we want more diversity in our viewing options. It happened because the United States, after so many years of being on top of the world, stopped paying attention to overseas markets. They just were used to the idea that if we make this movie, people will see it. And they furthermore were not interested in countries that had no purchasing power. Korea was a poor country, it was a third world country, and weirdly enough, this was a huge advantage. A huge advantage. Because they understand that, you know, how economic development works, they understand that countries usually become richer and not poorer unless there's war or famine. So I'll give you an example of something they did. In Paraguay, there's a language that's spoken indigenously other than Spanish. The second official language, I don't know how to say it, Guarani. Guarani, maybe? Guarani. It's only spoken by a few million people. And no American Hollywood TV company would bother translating their shows into Guarani. And Korea does, so they pay for it with government money, because even though none of these people can afford to buy a smartphone now, they probably will, and not even a matter of 10 or 15 years, but probably in a matter of 3 to 5 years. And why wouldn't they buy Samsung? You know, it's, you know, because that's what everyone is using and they're used to it. You know, and the same thing with the plasma TVs, and then these people grow up and they occupy positions in government, and that's really when it starts, or, you know, when the rainmaking is going to start to happen. We haven't even seen it yet. This is the tip of the iceberg. And a lot of this is because, I mean, Korea didn't push America out. That wasn't necessary. America accidentally stepped aside. They do not do any research into what markets want, whereas Koreans do a lot of research. I was given a book by somebody, a fairly high-level person in the Korean government, and it was basically a textbook on every single world market, the culture there, and how to approach them based on what knowledge of their culture. So, for example, like there was a chapter on the Islam world that was broken down by country, and it said, okay, you know, in this part of the world, there are prayers at this and this and this hour of the day, so don't schedule any Korean dramas during those hours. You know, it was very, very granular. And one thing that helped Korea, that was sort of an accident of history, that nobody could have really predicted, was the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the last 20 years. So basically, what this means is that in places like Yemen and Saudi Arabia, they cannot show American dramas until after midnight. There's just too much sex. Not only that, they can't show them on terrestrial TV. You can only do it if you have a satellite dish, which means if you have money. In Korean dramas, I don't know if you've ever seen them, there's no sex. People usually don't even kiss until episode 8. You can show this. This is family viewing. You can show it in prime time, and you can show it on, you know, regular terrestrial TV. So there's literally an entire generation of young people in the Muslim world, I should say fundamentalist Muslim countries, that is much more familiar with Korean dramas than with American dramas. There was one a couple of years ago called Jumong, and it takes place in, I think, the 1st century. It's a costume drama, and I can't imagine why anyone outside Korea would want to watch this. But in Iran, it had over 80% audience share. I mean, 80% is more than the number of people who watch the Olympics worldwide. So if you think about what happens to these kids and when they grow up and they make decisions for their country, I mean, then this whole pop culture thing is starting to make sense. So how am I doing on time?
5 more minutes.
Okay, I wanted to talk about one more thing that has helped with the Korean economy and the K-pop boom. And this is sort of controversial because it has to do with something called Han, which is a culturally specific form of rage. By definition, you can only have it if you're Korean. And it comes from the fact that supposedly Korea has, in its 5,000-year history, been invaded 400 times, but has never actually unilaterally invaded any other country. And I'm going to actually read to you just the section that I wrote on it, because otherwise I'd just be quoting from myself anyway. So I start with a quote from Goldfinger, which is by Ian Fleming. It's a James Bond book. "Koreans are the cruelest, most ruthless people in the world," wrote Ian Fleming in Goldfinger, adding that Koreans have no respect for human life. In this scene, the supervillain of the title is explaining to James Bond why he picked only Koreans as bodyguards, among whom is the stocky, grunting, subhuman karate expert Oddjob, who decapitates people by hurling his razor-sharp black bowler hat at them. Fleming's description of Koreans is regarded as widely racist, but my desire to be offended is contradicted by a sheepish, "how did he know?" sort of feeling. In order to understand the Korean drive that propelled the country to wealth, you have to know that Korea has been the whipping boy of fate for 5,000 years. The peninsula has been invaded 400 times in its history and has never once invaded any other nation. The result of all this abuse is a culturally specific, ultra-distilled form of rage, which Koreans call Han. I actually interviewed director Park Chan-wook. He did The Old Boy, he did the Vengeance trilogy, and you can see evidence of Han in a lot of Korean movies. Park, I should say, claims that his movies aren't about Han, but I still think that they're the best illustration in pop culture of what Han is. And so I asked him, "Can you define Han?" And he said, "Han only occurs when you cannot achieve proper vengeance, when your vengeance is not successful." And then I asked my mom to define Han, and she gave these examples that were just really gruesome. One was, when sad things happen not by your own design, but by fate, and over a long period of time. So if a baby is abandoned by his parents and suffers throughout his childhood because there's no one to take care of him, then he feels Han toward his parents. If a woman gets married young and her husband abandons her for another woman and leaves the wife no money, and the wife has to live a life of strife, then she builds up Han toward her husband. And finally, Koreans have Han toward the Japanese. The rivalry between Korea and Japan is like another story for another lecture, but it goes back at least 600 years, and people people outside do not understand what's going on there. Because England and France fought a war for literally 100 years. It was a 100 years war, but now they're allies, and aside from the occasional joke, they're not really hostile to each other, whereas Koreans and Japanese are still actively very hostile. But strangely enough, this ended up serving Korea well, because one of their motivations for succeeding was they wanted to beat Japan at something. This was not going to happen militarily because it's the 21st century, and it's at the end of history, and everyone is friends now except for ISIS. The whole world is friends. So the only way they could beat Japan was actually through money and through pop culture, basically the coolness stakes. So that was a huge motivator for them. With that, I think I'm going to open up to questions. Does anybody want to start? Otherwise, Come on, this is the first time no one's had any questions.
Yes,
Go ahead.
let people think.
So I'm a faculty member here at Boston College, and I go back and forth to Asia. In fact, we were just in Seoul and 3 other countries in May. We routinely go and visit them. So I found your book a couple of months ago. I finished it 2 weeks ago. I loved it.
Thank you.
And then I found out from Professor Chung that you were coming to DC. So thank you for coming. It's really exciting to have you here.
Thank you.
And it's a great book. And if you haven't read it yet, by the way, I definitely recommend it.
It's also for sale outside,
Yeah.
and she'll be happy to do a book signing afterward.
My question is that given your background and all of your journalism, especially in finance, etc., do you think that you should invest, or we should invest in South Korea right now? Do you think the best is yet to come? Do you think the best is already happened? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what do you mean invest in South Korea? You mean like buy
Like, would you, if you...
ETFs or?
Yeah, I mean, whether it be ETFs, exchange-traded funds, or whether it be investing in companies, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in terms of...
Oh, God.
Because the Hallyu thing, I agree with. I think it's wonderful what they've done.
Right.
And, you know, Japan of the lost decade of the 90s, et cetera, and they're, with Abenomics, are trying to rebuild. Where are your thoughts right now?
God, you're asking me to make a stock recommendation. Well, I mean, that's a little complicated because, I mean, there's no individual company that I would say is guaranteed to go up and up. Because as I said, the goal, it's like, you know, this isn't a great analogy, but, you know, Microsoft's finances does not depend on the success of PowerPoint, right? If people stop using PowerPoint, it doesn't mean they have to close Microsoft. And the same thing is true of Korea and all these different products. I don't know which member of the Microsoft Office suite, you know, you should be betting on. It's sort of the whole suite. So I don't know. I mean, maybe ETFs. I wouldn't do real estate at this point. You probably don't have an in. It's very, very it's really difficult to get real estate. And the other thing, honestly, is that so much changes so rapidly. I mean, I don't want to undo all of the PR that I've done for Korea, but things change so rapidly that I would be very, very hesitant to invest in Korea, except in the 10% of your portfolio that you devote to high-risk investments anyway. So, yes.
Euny, I'm Ellen Sullivan. I work here at BC. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask what has been the reaction to the book in Korea, and more specifically, have you received a call from the Ministry of Culture inviting you to a meeting?
Is there a specific meeting?
No.
Like,
I'm just curious. What
is there
has
a
been
ball that I was invited?
what has been the response of the Korean government to the scenario that you portray?
Everyone who was interviewed for the book is really happy about it, which is not that surprising. I mean, if any of you write books, and I certainly hope some of you do, one thing that you might, if it's nonfiction, one thing you might find is that people don't want to talk to you, and they're very controlling about what you say, and they're very angry. But in the end, you know, they just can't get over the excitement of their name being in print, and they give copies to all of their friends, no matter what you say about them. So everyone who was in the book was uniformly happy, and the rest is split down the middle with some people. For some reason, it's by age. Older people said this is a really patriotic book, and younger people were really offended. They were really offended. Yeah. By what specifically? I mean, I'm very critical in the book of things like the Korean educational system, which I'm a product, and a lot of my success in life has to do with that. But it's extremely flawed, and a lot of people just don't want me to talk about how Korean pop culture is a government orchestrated thing, because it makes them really angry. Because the idea of cool is supposed to be effortless, you know, it's not supposed to be something that you build. But I mean, in Korea, everything is done by study. Everything that they've ever done is approached in the same way, which is, we could do this. We can study, you can study for an exam, you can be #1 in the world in the internet. And in fact, one of the big pushes for the pop culture wave was a paper about Jurassic Park. That a Korean economist team in the 90s put together a paper about Jurassic Park saying, well, this this movie made the same amount of money that we would have to sell 15 million printed cards to make the same amount of money, we could make a Jurassic Park. How hard could it possibly be? You know? And that's essentially what they're doing now. I mean, this is the next wave that, I mean, after all the pop culture of, you know, the music and the videos and all that is gone, they're doing entertainment technology. They're developing like super realistic 3D holograms and the kind of thing that you would expect Industrial Light and Magic to do, or Skywalker Ranch, or Pixar, except in Korea it's funded by the government, and the country's best scientists are actually on this. So, yes?
Can you talk about the relationship of the film industry to this? Is the film industry as orchestrated as K-pop and K-drama and as closely aligned with the government, or is there a greater sense of genuine creativity and sort of artistry in the film industry?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, there is government support in the sense that, I mean, the UK does this as well, the UK Film Council. Anytime you buy a movie ticket in Korea, a percentage of it goes to the Korean Film Council, which goes to funding independent movies. And the UK does exactly the same thing with lotto tickets, for example. In that sense, it is government funded. On the other hand, if you pay attention to all this whole basket of Korean pop culture, one thing that you may notice is that the movies are really violent and there's lots of sex, and the dramas are exactly the opposite. And the reason for that is that cinema is still considered an art form, and I mean, this is true everywhere, but pop culture, high and low culture in Korea are completely separated. They're funded by completely different budgets. And cinema is allowed to be artistic, and especially when they lifted these censorship laws in the early 2000s, that's when we really saw this flourishing of Korean cinema. And did they go a little bit overboard with the violence? Maybe. I mean, because like all these years of censorship and so forth being lifted, I mean, that kind of makes sense. But the reason that cinema has a completely different flavor from every single other aspect of Korean pop culture is because cinema is still considered high culture, and everything else that they're pushing out for export is considered low culture. So, yes.
I went to Korea this past summer, and when I was there, I mean, that was only my second time going, so I'm not very familiar with culture there. But when I went, I felt like you said, people are very connected on their electronics, and very, like almost to be obsessive. And I felt like that was very unhealthy. Maybe that's just the way I look at it.
Yeah.
But do you think that because the government made these moves to come this far, they sacrificed the well-being of their citizens?
I'm glad you asked that. That's sort of one of the number one ongoing national debates, actually, is at what price is this success coming? And a friend of mine who went to Korea for the first time showed me a picture that he took with his phone of like a little kid on a bicycle who was texting at the same time. And that's a serious problem, and like, you know, and it's one of the downsides of being so connected. Like in the subway, there's 2 internet hubs in every subway car, so everyone can actually watch streaming at the same time. And so that's kind of what they're doing, and you see all these ads on TV about like, you know, 2 lovers in an embrace and they're both looking at their phones. I mean, that's actually what it's like just being like on the streets of Seoul or in the subway.
So true.
You know, on the other hand, people who are like nostalgic for old Korea, it's kind of like Americans who say that I wish that Paris was the way it was before because their favorite bakery is closed or something. I mean, it's not really good nostalgia. I mean, Korea was never great when it was poor. There was nothing really good about it. I mean, and anyone who's saying we miss traditional Korea, I don't even know what they're talking about. Like Korea was a Japanese colony from 1905 to 1945. And then there was a war, and then, I mean, unless you were born before 1905, I'm just not going to believe you. And you say, you know, Korean traditions have eroded, and this is a terrible thing. You know, so, I hope that answers your question. The back?
I just want to say that the street food has gotten a lot worse. The street food has gotten a lot worse.
No, I agree with you there.
Yeah. That's something to miss. I was wondering, you said something about how Psy was surprised at his own popularity, and I wonder if you could follow up. Like, he was not, you know, a product of the, you know, of the system, and in fact, a lot of his music is kind of a criticism of the system. So, what do we do with his popularity?
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, in addition to not being a product of the star system, he has the wrong look. He's too old. He never had cosmetic surgery. And he's a singer-songwriter, which is not considered a bad thing, but it's extremely, extremely rare. You know, they just don't have this culture of like people strumming and cafes and being discovered. You know, the songs are written in Sweden. The choreography comes from America. It's all, you know, it's all put together in this particular packaging, and he didn't come from that. I mean, his background is basically the same as mine. I mean, we were both growing up in Gangnam around the same time. We were approximately the same age. We went to rival schools. His family is a little bit like my family, which is to say, I am certain they were destroyed when he said he wanted to be a pop star. And he was definitely an outlier. I mean, Korea has been trying to push other bands to be the video that got, well, now it's, I think Gangnam Style now has 2.3 billion hits. And Korea wanted, you know, Girls' Generation to be that video, or, you know, or Big Bang, or any of these like traditionally beautiful K-pop bands. And Psy was the shot heard around the world. And one of the things I talk about in my book is that Psy shows that irony now exists in Korea. And when I was growing there, I can say with complete confidence that it did not exist. A poor country can't have irony. Every single satirist that you've ever heard of, from Sophocles to Jonathan Swift to Cervantes, wrote at the time that their country was basically the world leader for their period. And you know, because if you're a developing country, you have to worry about acquiring wealth, and it's not funny. I mean, and satire is almost always about making fun of the upper class, making fun of people with money. And you can't do that if you're poor yourself. I mean, that's just, it doesn't make any sense. So only after Korea became very wealthy could you have a song like Gangnam Style, where I'm sure you've seen it many times, but you know, he's basically making fun of materialism and conspicuous consumption. And if he had tried to do this, if he had tried this 30 years ago, it would have been insensitive and disgusting. And there are people who didn't have indoor plumbing, and you're making fun of people being rich. It doesn't make any sense. So I think that it was when the world was able to see that Koreans actually had a sense of humor. That was sort of the unexpected element that tied this all together, because that is cool. You know, that is, humor is part of being cool. And Psy, weirdly enough, was the one who showed that Koreans are funny. So, yeah.
So are these people working on, like you said, the top scientists are working on engineering this culture? Do they have like a feeling that they're serving their country in that sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, the government's paying their salaries, and basically all of the most stressful jobs, anyone who's working in the pop culture industry, those are the most stressful jobs right now. And they're probably the most prestigious jobs. And yeah, I think they are doing with a sense of patriotism. Because it's not just that they want to discover, they want to make the next Pixar-like film, or or Jurassic Park-like film. They want to make something that the whole world is going to use over and over again. So like I was talking about 3D hologram technology, that is a huge deal over there. Because you have 2D technology now. I mean, you can have a hologram that makes it look like P. Diddy is singing at the American Music Awards. But first of all, it doesn't really look like a person. It's obviously just flickering lights. Second, if you're looking at it full frontal, then you can see P. Diddy. If you look at it from the side, it's just like flickering lights. And you can't see it from the back because that's where the projection is coming from. Whereas they're working on a fully 3D, realistic-looking hologram where you actually literally cannot tell if it's real or not without putting your hand through it or something. And you're thinking, well, what is the point of this? Well, I mean, superficially, the point is so that you can have a concert with, Girls' Generation can have a concert in Seoul, and it can be broadcast in every single city in the world, and everyone will be experiencing literally the exact same, having the same experience. That doesn't seem like it's very useful, but it's like the World Wide Web or anything else. The superficial use seems very stupid, but the technology that goes into it is what everyone starts to use. It can be theoretically, it can be used in warfare. You could have. It can be used in medicine, where if a surgeon is performing something and he wants to teach other people how to do this procedure, the 3D hologram is actually really useful for that. Even though it sounds like really sort of stupid and a waste of money, it's not. And so for that reason, I think that they're doing it realizing that it is very tied to sort of Korea, the brand, and the next thing that Korea is going to do. So.
I'm from Japan, and I'm working on a paper on K-pop in Japan because it looks like a lot more popular in Japan than compared to other countries. So do you think Korea puts more effort in selling culture in Japan compared to other countries.
Yeah, that's another thing that it was a very, very intentional move to market to Japan, because Japan is actually the second biggest music market in the entire world, America being the first, obviously. And no other country was marketing music specifically to Japan. Korea was the first one to do it, and they actually have their bands record, like the Girls' Generation has, I think, 3 albums that are recorded entirely in Japanese. And this was very deliberate. This is one thing that when I say that America's not paying attention, this is like a serious problem. Like Japan's a perfect example of that. They completely ignored the Japanese market, because they had no idea that it was going to be this big, and they had no idea. I mean, one thing that was sort of unexpected is that Japan still buys CDs. Right? In every single other country, people only download music. CDs are a waste of money. Japan still buys physical CDs. One theory that's been given out is that they really are very fond of packaging. If you go to a Japanese department store, everything's wrapped really carefully, beautiful paper and ribbon and maybe like potpourri or perfume on it or something. And Koreans were a colony of Japan, so they know about this. And so they package their CDs with like all kinds of stuff in it. So like there's like a photo, there's one that has an 80-page photo book, or the pop-up book of the stars, and you can sell a CD for $150 in Japan, and people buy it. And no other country has rising CD sales and lower and less digital sales except for Japan. And Korea got really lucky that they focused on the Japanese market, and America was completely ignoring it. So, yes.
One last question?
Yeah.
That's the last question, since you were talking about Japan. I was curious, because I was thinking about the 80s, when Japan, anime and, like video games and, it was Rising Sun and there was all this Japanophobia and everything. But I'm wondering if you think that Korean pop culture kind of supplanted or replaced or eclipsed Japanese pop culture, or if there's room in the American psyche, at least, for more than one producer of culture to come out of Asia. Like, is it like zero-sum game within Asia?
Right. I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I don't think that K-pop replaced anything. As I said, it's just, the generation that's been raised, I guess it's you guys, the generation that's been raised in the internet that doesn't really remember a time when there wasn't the internet, their view of foreignness is completely different from that of any previous generation. Like, if you're somebody who's like, like my sort of age, and let's say you're American, you've always lived in America, somebody sends you, first of all, how would you send somebody a video? You can't, if there's no internet before the internet, you can't send them a link. So what would you send them, a VHS or something? So let's assume that you did send them a VHS of a K-pop song, and let's assume that you put this in the mail for some reason. They would be like, I don't understand this language, I don't understand what's going on, okay, whatever. But if you're raised on the internet, it's very normal for your friend to say, okay, this is hilarious, and you'll click on it, and you're not going to be like, oh, I don't understand this language, I don't know what's going on. And that's huge, and this is why it's not just Korean pop culture that's big, and that's what my book is about. But I think that it's not just me who thinks so. A global pop culture is becoming big. So, for example, in Spain, the #1 series in 2012 was called Isabella, and it's about Queen Isabella, the one who funded Columbus's voyage. I don't think this mini-series is about Columbus. It's just some kind of it's like a history. It's like Downton Abbey, except in Spain or something. But even though it was #1 in Spain, even though Spanish was a very widely spoken language, not a single American channel or distributor wanted to pick it up. Who did pick it up? Drama Fever, which is a Korean drama streaming site. And so what does Korea have to do with Spanish? Well, nothing and everything. It's just that it's now, it's just that the fact that, the Koreans know that there is a market for global TV, not just Korean TV. So to me, it's not shocking at all that this Spanish drama was picked up by a Korean drama site, and we're just going to see more and more of that. There's no such thing as must-see TV Thursday anymore. Most people don't watch TV on their TV. You know, must-see TV Thursday was whatever, in the late 90s, in the heyday of NBC. So it was like at 8 o'clock, I think it was like Friends, and then Mad About You, and then Seinfeld, and then ER. And you would literally stay at home and watch TV all day Thursday. That doesn't exist anymore. It doesn't need to. You have DVR. I mean, I don't remember, I almost never watch TV on TV anymore because I'm bored with commercials. So, you know, and most people are like that. So I'll watch it on, watch it on Hulu. And this means that there's room for so much more than there was before. So long way, TLDR, it's not a zero-sum game. There's room for everybody. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much.